Carl, you're a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota, and you were the McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History here at the Library of Congress back in 2019. Thanks for coming back to the library to talk about your new book.
Thanks for having me. I was working on it when I was here, so I was glad to finally bring it full circle.
Yeah, I was going to say the new book is titled The Occasional Human Sacrifice: Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No. It's out this year, I think just this month, right?
Yeah, just last month.
From W.W. Norton.
Right.
And maybe we could start there. Tell us a little bit about your background and then how this book came about.
My background is in medicine and philosophy. I trained in medicine first and then went to graduate school in philosophy, and have been at the University of Minnesota since 1997. First in the Center for Bioethics, but now in the Department of Philosophy. And so this book is sort of framed and, I guess, motivated by my own efforts to try to expose and get an external investigation into a death, a suicide in a psychiatric clinical trial at the University of Minnesota that happened in 2003, but then I learned about in 2008. And it was not a successful effort. I mean, I have to say, from the outside, it seemed like a success in the sense that I wrote about it for Mother Jones Magazine. There was a sort of group of us working to get an investigation for another 5 years after that. This didn't make me a very popular figure at the University of Minnesota, particularly in the medical school where I worked. But we eventually did, and had a report by a state watchdog agency, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which found a lot of the things that were troubling about the trial in the first place, that the conditions under which the young man was recruited were coercive, that there were conflicts of interest, that there had been an effort to deflect scrutiny by the administration for years. So from the outside, it seemed like a vindication, and yet it really changed nothing. There was no compensation to the young man's mother. There was no official apology. And there were no sanctions for the researchers at fault, and no real changes at the university as a result. No reform, no meaningful reform. And so, after working on this case for 7 years or so, and then ostensibly winning and seeing what winning looked like, which looked a lot like losing, I started to wonder, do things ever go any better elsewhere? And so that's what led me into here, which is, a series of investigations and interviews with people at other institutions who have blown the whistle on abuses to human subjects there.
So I know as I was reading the book, then you have a lot of case studies in it, different whistleblowers, different institutions. And I found myself going back and forth between disbelief, as some of it was just stunning. How could this be happening in some of our most esteemed institutions? And then, cycling between disbelief and rage and empathy for some of the folks who were involved in the medical research and what was going on. And I was going back and forth between these emotions. I wonder, though, if there's, and there's a lot of tragic stories, but you also tell the stories of some heroic folks, some folks who really are committed to bringing about change. I wonder if we could start there, perhaps with a story of a whistleblower who, even in a partial way, was able to achieve to make a difference and to change the way things were done.
Well, there are a handful of them, I think, who, from the outside, it would seem as if they were successful. And yet, when you start to talk to them and you dig deeper, you find out that they are just really deeply scarred by the experience and haunted by it, even though, even if they've come through it in what seems to be a relatively intact way. So here's an example. There's a obstetrician gynecologist in New Zealand named Ron Jones. He was one of 3 whistleblowers at the National Women's Hospital in New Zealand, who exposed what New Zealanders called the so-called the unfortunate experiment. This was a study in which women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated for years and often decades, and then many of them went on to develop cervical cancer and some died. And this study went on for nearly 2 decades. And Ron Jones and Bill McIndoe and Jock McLean, the 3 who worked at exposing this thing, again, were eventually successful in the sense that they published data, it was convincing data, it was picked up by the press, and became a national scandal. This would have been in 1987. Now, from the outside, once that happened, I mean, it took them, nearly 2 decades to get, the newspaper story. But once that happened, the New Zealand government essentially did everything right. They did everything you would want someone to do from the outside if you're a whistleblower, right? They immediately appointed a judicial inquiry. They had hearings that lasted 6 months. The victims were given a voice. They were given, the victims and their families, given the opportunity to testify in public. The researchers behind it, the main researcher, Herb Green, and the other staff members at National Women's Hospital who helped cover it up, were forced to answer in public. And when it was over, they produced a report. It was comprehensive. The victims were compensated. The villains were sanctioned. And then they remade their research oversight system. And in the last 35 years, they have not had a similar scandal. That's exactly what you would want to happen. But Ron Jones is haunted by the whole thing. I mean, even now, he's in his 80s. He will say, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about this. It was extremely painful. He lost friends. His wife died of breast cancer right at the time of the inquiry. One of the other whistleblowers, Bill McIndoe, died right before the inquiry. And the whole thing has been so traumatic, in part because of all that, but in part also because the National Women's Hospital really didn't survive it. It doesn't even exist anymore. And he is often blamed for that. There's still efforts to kind of rewrite history and challenge, the whole whistleblowing affair. And, it essentially changed his life. There's a sort of, before period and after period, and afterwards things are never the same. And that seems to be very often the case with whistleblowers.
It sounds like whistleblowers are, by necessity, they end up being very lonely, very isolated. How if there is a type, or how would you describe whistleblowers as a whole? Are they, do they have similar character traits? What's driving them? What are their motivations? how do they tend to go about the business of what they're doing in your observation?
Well, I mean, there are many other people who've studied whistleblowers over the years, and many of whom are much better trained at, in psychology and sociology than I am. And a lot of them want there to be a particular whistleblower type. They want to find out, how do we predict which people will blow the whistle and which people will stay quiet? And in general, those efforts are not convincing. I don't think there really is a whistleblower type. That said, I did find a certain way of talking about the episode that seemed, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them seem to have in common, which is if you ask them to talk about why they did it, they will turn the conversations to themselves. And they'll say things like, well, how could I look at myself in the mirror if I didn't say anything? Or how could I hold my head up if I didn't say anything? Or how could I face my children if I didn't say anything? In other words, even if they're acting out of principle, or even if they are motivated by deep empathy for the victims, they don't talk about the victims, and they don't talk about principles. They talk about themselves. And in the book, I try to describe this in the language of honor. And by honor, I mean the language of respect and self-respect. And I think that's sort of what people are getting at when they say, how could I hold my head up? How could I respect myself if I didn't do this? So I think that's sort of one common element. The other common element, I've got to say, and I don't know that this is a whistleblower trait. It may be a trait of the people that I talk to, simply because their ordeals lasted so long and they persisted, and they at least had enough success so that I know about the case and could identify them. And that's a kind of tenacity. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, Ron Jones, for example, he worked on this, he and the others, it took 20 years to expose this. Peter Buxton, the whistleblower in the Tuskegee syphilis study, it took him 7 years. Martha Stevens, the whistleblower, the English professor whistleblower at the University of Cincinnati, she blew the whistle twice, once in the 1970s, but then stayed with it, and when it emerged again in the 1990s, she kept at it again, and then kept at it afterwards and wrote a book about it. I mean, it takes a kind of, stubbornness, hard-headedness, some kind of tenacity to just not be willing to let this go for such a long period.
I was struck by your description of Martha Stevens, who you mentioned. I think I got her name right. Is that Martha
Yeah.
Stevens? And this was someone who was in an entirely different department, a different discipline, in a humanities department, who was essentially got involved with a case at the medical school. Can you tell us a little bit about her story?
Yeah, she's fantastic. I should say a little bit about the study. So this was a Pentagon-funded radiation study in the 1960s, from 1960 to 1972, conducted by a radiologist at the University of Cincinnati named Eugene Sanger. And the aim of the study was to figure out how much radiation an American soldier could withstand in case of a nuclear attack. This is Vietnam era, right? So they wanted to know, if you're flying a plane, how long can you keep flying it? Will you get nauseous? Will you pass out? Will it impair your vision or your hearing? These sorts of things. And so to figure this out for soldiers, they recruited, they tested whole body radiation on cancer patients. most of them, maybe all of them poor, about 60% of them African American, without telling them that the study was funded by the military, without telling them the purpose of the study, and without telling them that they might die while they're in the study. And some of them actually did. So Martha was not the one who uncovered this. She was a young English professor, untenured, and read about it. She remembers it being in the Village Voice. I'm not sure it was. I think it may have been in the Washington Post. It was given to her by an article about this by one of her colleagues. And you got to remember, this is sort of at the height of the anti-war movement, and she was very involved in that. And she saw Pentagon-funded military research here at the University of Minnesota. The University of Cincinnati. I've got to find out about that. And she went over to the medical school, started asking around, eventually convinced the dean to let her see the study records, and read them, was horrified, and educated herself about them, brought them to this set of colleagues, also young, untenured, activist types called the Junior Faculty Association. And they put together a statement, had a press conference. It turned out that there's a stringer from the Washington Post there. It wound up in the Post. From the Post, caught the attention of Senator Ted Kennedy. He entered it in the Congressional Record and was conducting hearings on a number of sort of issues involving medical misconduct at the time. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of that study.
When Martha Stevens started digging through the records and she realized that this was a study that was being construed as a medical study, but in fact it was for defense purposes, did she realize that people were dying in the process, or what was it that really motivated her to get further involved?
It was the case reports. I mean, there were very detailed case reports about each patient, and she was just very moved by these accounts of the patients themselves. And the amazing thing about it, I mean, it's really worth going back to the Congressional Record and reading the piece that she read, that she wrote, because this is in the very early days of formal bioethics, formal research ethics. But she picked out exactly the issues that anybody now looking at this study would pick out. And one of the things that she picked out was, look, you say that this is for therapeutic purposes, that this radiation might benefit these people with cancer. Well, why aren't you measuring that, and why aren't you publishing on it? What you're measuring and publishing on is, how does this people, the kind of results that the military wanted, not whether or not it was, curing their cancer. And is it really plausible that you could have these studies going on for 12 years and not publish a single study, a single case report, journal article about cure rates?
So we mentioned Martha Stevens. We've talked about Martha Stevens and how she first got involved with reviewing records and becoming a whistleblower in the 70s. You mentioned that she also, well, for one, she was in this other department in the humanities. She was an English professor. And then you mentioned that she went back and wrote a book about all this. Can you tell us the end of that story?
Yeah. Well, so there was a kind of partial, when she initially spoke out about this in 1972, there was a kind of victory in the sense that the ensuing controversy, despite many, many denials and defenses and external reviews by the university, she stopped the study. So the study stopped in 1972. But it never really became a huge public issue. it was kind of swept under the rug. And now a lot of people don't know about those studies in the way that they know, for example, about the Tuskegee syphilis study, right, and other studies of that period. And so she kind of forgot about it because it wasn't happening again. But then in the 1990s, as a result of a series of articles written by Eileen Wellsome, which eventually won a Pulitzer Prize, it became clear that Cincinnati radiation studies were not alone, that there was a whole series of government-funded radiation studies taking place at sites all over the United States. And so interest suddenly surged again. And President Clinton decided to appoint a commission, a radiation commission, to look at all of these. And so suddenly there's another chance. And what Martha Stevens decided to do was, you know what? Most of the victims of this study, their families don't even know that they were in a study. Now is the time to let them know. And she and a graduate student of hers started trying to track them down. And with very limited tools, like this was kind of pre-internet days, right? Or at least pre-sophisticated internet days. So a lot of it was just courthouse records and this sort of thing. And so they tracked them down, found them, told them what had happened, and put them in touch with a lawyer. And then there was a lawsuit as a result. Now, and there was also the Radiation Commission that was looking at those studies, plus a whole array of other studies. Neither of those efforts were very satisfactory to the victims. The lawsuits went on like forever. The university and researchers fought them, tooth and nail. Eugene Sanger, the architect of the studies, refused to apologize. There was eventually a settlement, but again, not one that was very satisfactory to the victims. And then there was the Radiation Commission, which came out with a big report, but that was not very satisfactory to the victims either. So then when it was all done, Martha still wasn't finished, and she wrote a book about it called The Treatment, which was published by Duke University Press. It's excellent. I think sometime in the early 2000s or so. Mainly, I think, to make sure that this, that it's not forgotten. This is the thing that, is part of the frustration of these scandals. Very often, all the victims want. They're not looking for money. They're not looking for compensation. They're just looking for some kind of acknowledgement and somebody to say, "I'm sorry, you were right. Your mother, your father, your sister was wronged." And that's the one thing that academic medical centers will not do. They will not apologize. The only way they apologize is if someone forces them to apologize from the outside.
Did anything come about after that in terms of regulations that would ensure that this kind of thing would not happen again?
Something did come about, but it wasn't as a result. It may have been as a result of her work on those studies. But 1972 is the year when it was the year that the Tuskegee syphilis study came to light in July of 1972. It was the year of the investigative report into the Willowbrook State School, which is where the hepatitis A and B experiments conducted by Saul Krugman emerged. And it was also the year when the Cincinnati studies became a public issue. But interestingly, and it's a sort of a mystery why, the Senate hearings that resulted didn't include the Cincinnati studies. Tuskegee was really the motivator for that. And there were huge reforms as a result. The legacy has not been what one would hope, but those hearings led to the National Research Act in 1974. It led to the current oversight system, which is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board system. There was a presidential commission appointed, produced a document called the Belmont Report, which has been influential. And the regulations, or guidelines, I should say, the common rule that govern research, all that emerged out of that period in the early 1970s. Whether or not those reforms have been sufficient or adequate, I think is another question.
So Martha Stevens is an example of someone who made her own choice to get involved, and to the degree that she did. On the other hand, when I read the story of John Pizzando, it struck me as a very different kind of story. This was someone who was involved institutionally, who was an idealistic young researcher, and he did not make a choice to get involved. He simply was there and had no choice but to witness what was going on. Can you tell us a little bit more about his situation?
Yeah, so John Pizzando, I think it was the early to mid 1980s when he moved to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. He's an oncologist, immunologist, about as impressive a CV as you could come up with. I mean, this guy was Harvard undergraduate, MD, PhD at Albert Einstein, internal medicine training at University of Pennsylvania, NIH funded, assistant professor at Harvard, working at Dana-Farber, and moves across the country to take up what was, he thought was going to be a step up to work at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle, and was invited, more like forced, but invited to be on the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, which is, the research oversight committee that, that all research in an academic medical center has to go through before it can proceed. And while he was on the IRB, he learned about a study. It was an experimental bone marrow transplant study for patients with leukemia and lymphoma called Protocol 126, and it was already ongoing. This would eventually turn out to be a disastrous study in which almost nobody survived, and in which according to a Seattle Times investigative report, many years later, led to the deaths of at least 21 subjects, many of whom had leukemia and lymphoma with a decent, maybe 60% chance of full remission or cure after a standard bone marrow transplant. The experimental bone marrow transplants failed at a much higher rate. And he became alarmed at this, and even more alarmed when he began taking care of patients who were in the study, and tried internally to get the study stopped. I mean, you would think that this would be fairly simple matter for someone on the IRB. The whole purpose of the IRB is to stop dangerous studies, right? To protect patients from studies like this. And yet he couldn't. And when he raised questions outside the IRB, he couldn't. And so after 5 years, he was told, we don't have a place for you anymore. You're not a team player. And he was let go. And he never worked in cancer research again. This was thinking probably at the end of the 1980s. And since then, most of his career has been spent reviewing disability claims for the federal government. He, once again, you know, you talk about tenacity. I mean, this guy had, you know, a kind of unbelievable drive. And he didn't forget about it. And he later learned that that protocol, 126, was being funded by a biotech company, and that the researchers had been given financial incentives, which should have been a disqualifying conflict of interest that, you know, with a functioning IRB would have been flagged and managed or stopped, but weren't. And suddenly, it all clicked for him. This must be why they were insisting on continuing this study long after it was clear that people were dying in the study. And so at that point, he started writing letters, filing complaints, you know, essentially trying to get the attention of anybody that he could to try to stop this thing and expose it. And he failed completely. I mean, he got an investigation by the Office of the Human Research Protection. They cleared the Fred Hutch completely. He got the study, he convinced the Seattle Times to do this, you know, long, extensive investigative report. It was terrific. It won prizes. It was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. It won almost every other journalism prize you could think of. And that did no good. Then there was a lawsuit brought by family members who learned about the deaths of their family members, that their family members had died in this research protocol, many of whom didn't even know that they were in a research protocol. They brought a lawsuit. They got nothing. So at every point, he did everything he could to get some sort of justice for the victims of that study, and nothing worked. And so, I mean, it's a very, it's a sad, demoralizing, just horrible, unjust ending to the story. And how do you deal with that? You know, what sort of story do you tell yourself if you have essentially sacrificed your career and accomplished nothing?
So this was one of the case studies that I had the hardest time absorbing and just really getting my mind around. And I guess I'm still curious, was it a matter, there were all of these institutional guardrails were seemingly in place and doing what they were meant to do. Was it an active institutional cover-up? Was the data somehow unclear? What went wrong, and what could have prevented this miscarriage of research and of practice?
Well, I mean, part of it is the way the oversight system is set up. So IRBs are, not all now, but at least back then, were almost exclusively a kind of internal peer review committee, right? It's made up of staff members, mostly of staff members at an institution, right? And so essentially, you have faculty reviewing the research of their colleagues, and sometimes their superiors, which turned out to be the case here. One of the co-investigators in this study was a sort of towering figure in the world of bone marrow transplantation, Donald Thomas, who won the Nobel Prize in 1990 for his role in developing bone marrow transplantation. And so he was a senior figure there. And John's story is essentially everybody was terrified of him, that he was at the top, the rest of them were at the bottom, and he was the kind of figure that you didn't challenge. And so when he says, I want the IRB to just shut up and help the researchers, that's what they did. So that's part of it. I mean, there is a kind of structural deficiency in research oversight that permits this kind of thing. And it's not just at the Fred Hutch. I mean, one of the things that I began to do after my own experience at the University of Minnesota was to teach a class on research scandals. You know, we do nothing other than look at research scandals, like, you know, 2 scandals a week for a whole semester. And what I thought would be useful about it is if we could look at these things side by side, we could see the patterns that emerged. You know, how do things go so badly wrong? Is there any, you know, are there any counterexamples where things go right? What happens to the researchers? What happens to the victims? You know, what similarities and differences do they share? And in that course, there is no study that we look at that has not been approved by an IRB or an IRB equivalent. You know, so you know, I shouldn't say none, because sometimes there's a way around the IRB, but in the vast majority of cases, with just a couple of exceptions, the IRB is complicit in some way. And you can understand why an IRB, if it has already approved a study and said it's ethical, it can go ahead, will then have an interest in defending that earlier decision, even if problems emerge later on. That is one of the structural deficiencies that New Zealand tried to get rid of after the unfortunate experiment. It's like, we need independent review, not review by your friends and colleagues, you know, in your own institution.
So in New Zealand, is that independent review simply a matter of course for any research study, or does it need to be triggered by a whistleblower or someone?
No, that's for all of them.
For all,
now.
okay.
Yeah. Internal review boards do exist for some studies, but not for medical studies.
So Carl, you trained as a medical doctor before you went back and studied philosophy and ethics. And I'm wondering, as you've been looking at all of these different case studies in the U.S. as well as internationally, the U.S. medical system, in some respects, and the research apparatus around it is really, the best in class in certain areas in terms of promoting research, creating new therapies, creating new drugs. And yet there are all of these cases in which things seem to go dreadfully awry. If you could change anything in how studies are reviewed or in the incentives for researchers in academic medicine, what would that look like? What would you change at a systemic level that could help prevent some of these abuses?
So, I mean, there are two ways to look at this question. One is the question of how do we get better oversight of research, and how do we prevent these things from happening? The other question is, how do we support and encourage whistleblowers to do something to help them to when they see bad things happening? And those two questions are interrelated, but they're a little bit separate, and I think they require different answers. So my view of the research oversight system is that there's so many problems with it, but the two big ones to me are one, the conflicts of interest in the way that it's set up. We essentially have, in the United States, we have two kinds of IRBs. There's the traditional kinds of IRBs, which are the ones that I'm describing to you, where you, in an academic health center, have a panel, often a voluntary panel of reviewers who are made up of the staff of the institution. The conflicts of interest there are more personal. They're all employees of the institution. There is a kind of subtle pressure not to be too problematic, not to object too strenuously. It's very difficult for people to turn down protocols that are done by their friends, even harder to turn down protocols done by their immediate superiors. And so there are all these internal, personal conflicts of interest. We have another kind of institutional review board in America. They're called, some people call them independent IRBs. I call them for-profit IRBs because they're for-profit businesses. And these are outside of the institution, but they're for-profit businesses paid by the research sponsor. And so, you know, a drug company needs an ethics review, they will pay a for-profit IRB to review it. It's a fee-for-service transaction. Clearly, that's not regulation. You know, there's a financial conflict of interest there. So you need a system in which neither of those either the financial or the personal conflicts of interest exist. That would help a lot. The other thing that's problematic is that it is all a prospective paper review, right? So it is a review mainly of study design. And, you know, if you want to do a research study, you fill out a bunch of forms, you write up the protocol, it's submitted to an IRB, they look at this huge stack of papers and make a decision about it. And then, you know, off it goes. There is some continuing review, but it's relatively minimal over time. All the things that are written on paper are not all the things that can go wrong with a study. One of my favorite examples of this is a research organization, freestanding research organization in Florida called SFBC International that operated for 10 years out of a condemned motel. It was the largest freestanding clinical trial site in America, in North America, over 700 beds in a dilapidated Holiday Inn. They were recruiting largely undocumented immigrants to test the safety of experimental drugs. How does that happen? Like, how is it possible for the largest trial site in America to be operating out of this fire hazard of a hotel doing their studies on undocumented immigrants? Well, the review is, you know, taking place thousands of miles away on paper. Nobody ever goes in and sets foot, you know, in the trial site. So you can have all kinds of abuses in the way things are actually happening. You can have incompetent doctors. You can have all kinds of crazy things happening that the IRB doesn't even know about because either they don't ask those questions, they're not on the, you know, on the paper that you have to submit, or, you know, they're being conducted by people who lie. It's essentially an honor system, you know. The thing about honor systems is they depend on bystanders to report abuses, and that almost never happens. I mean, one of the things that other things I discovered in my class is that whistleblowers in medical research are extremely rare. They're the exception, not the rule. In most cases, doctors, nurses, study personnel know about the abuses for years. They know patients are dying. They know patients are being deceived, exploited, lied to, and they just say nothing. It's only the rare cases, the ones that I wrote about in the book, where people actually speak out.
Is there a way to incentivize doctors and nurses and medical professionals to take a stand on a more consistent basis when they see abuses?
Yeah, I mean, you could not fire them, not ostracize them, not discipline them, not ruin their careers. I mean, all these things would be useful. But, you know, sadly, that's the typical way that these things play out. And if you sociologists with better tools and knowledge than me have gone into organizations and asked bystanders, why didn't you do something? And when they ask them, why didn't you do something, they say, it wouldn't have done any good and I would have been punished. And both of those things are true. Probably would have not done any good and they probably would have been punished. So you need to fix those two things for one, like for a start.
Carl, in a previous book, you talked about an American writer, Walker Percy, and we've been talking about whistleblowers. It strikes me that Walker Percy was a different kind of a figure. He was more of a philosophical whistleblower of sorts, but it also struck me that you share some common characteristics with Percy. Percy went to medical school and then contracted TB and so left the medical profession, spent time in a sanatorium, read a lot of the existential philosophers, Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and so on, and then became a novelist and wrote about, in a philosophical way, some of the drawbacks and some of the deficiencies of the scientific method more broadly. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work on Walker Percy and maybe expanding the lens a little bit. We've been talking about whistleblowers very specifically in medical research. What does this look like from a broader philosophical perspective when we're considering the entirety of the scientific method? That's a very small question, I know.
Walker Percy kind of changed my life, to be honest. I knew nothing of Walker Percy until my third year of medical school, when a friend of mine, a classmate, who was also very disillusioned with medical school, his name was Daniel Fort, gave me a copy of The Moviegoer, and it was just like, this really messed me up when I was younger. You might like it. And I read it, and I had never read a book like this in which it felt almost as if the author had access to my inner psychology in a way. I almost felt as if this character that he was writing about, Binks Bowling, it was like channeling my own thoughts. I mean, the sense of familiarity that I got reading this was just unlike anything else. And I immediately finished it and thought, I don't understand this book, I have to read it again. And then finding out who he was, because, it turned out, okay, this guy is a Southerner like me. He went to medical school like me. He was very unhappy in medicine like me. And then he got tuberculosis. How do I get tuberculosis? That was my thought. This could save me from a medical career. I actually wrote to Percy toward the end of my time in medical school and basically kind of told him my plan, which was, I think I'm going to quit medicine and study philosophy instead. And amazingly, he wrote back to me. Short letter, but told me what I should be reading. But I mean, one of the things, to tie Percy back to this last book that I've written, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Percy used to talk about something that he called the community of the alienated. That was what his novels were all about, people who were kind of lost and alienated in the world and couldn't figure out why, and secretly wondered if it's not better off, they're not better off being alienated than the other people who just seemed happy in these horrific circumstances in which it just seemed very unclear what you were supposed to be doing and how you were supposed to be living your life. And so one of the things that he writes about is the difference between sort of being lost and alone and in a predicament and never reading a book, or reading a book about something totally different, and the person who's lost and alone and in a predicament reading a book about someone who's lost and alone and in a predicament. And then there's suddenly this kind of shock of recognition, which is exactly the shock of recognition that I got reading The Moviegoer, right? Suddenly, you're not alone anymore. You realize there are other people who feel the same way. There are other people who have been through this. And even if there are no solutions offered, you know, that kind of solidarity that's created between the reader and the writer of the book is somehow kind of weirdly encouraging and gratifying. And one of the things that I wanted to do with the book, I mean, what you got to realize is this is a book about whistleblowers, but this is not a Triumph of the Human Spirit book. This is a very demoralizing book, and it's a demoralizing book about some people who blew the whistle and did what they thought was the right thing, and it ruined their lives, and some people who did exactly that same thing and whose lives may not have been ruined, but they were really damaged and scarred and wounded in some way. And most of whom have never met or read about anybody else in that predicament. And my feeling was, look, these are all, or mostly, very demoralizing stories, but maybe they'll give some sort of sense of solidarity to someone who's trying to figure out what to do, or someone who's been through it and is trying to make sense of it, or even the people who I've written about in the book might have some of that, Percy-like community of the alienated by seeing their stories placed alongside a whole group of stories together. And so far, I think, at least from the feedback, I think at least some people have, felt that way.
Carl,
Yeah.
thanks for joining us today. The book we've been discussing, again, by Carl Elliott, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No. Was out just last month from W.W. Norton, and Carl wrote it while he was in residence at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress as the McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History. Carl, thanks again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.